r/askreddit, serious, historians, marine biologists, and cryptozoologists of Reddit. As far as legends in history go, what legendary creature do you believe may have been real and probably existed in some way? Or what supposedly legendary person in history was more than likely real? There are many diseases that the origin of the vampire myth can be traced back to, however I think rabies fits it the most. In the olden days, people would tie those suspected of it to trees. In about 3 days' time the disease would drastically change them. Extreme light sensitivity, paleness, aggression, excessive drooling. They would try to attack you and have bouts of either extreme slow fatigue or even adrenaline. Also, rabies can be passed from person to person through a bite, not just an infected animal. Rabies honestly sounds like how a modern zombie virus would work, but unlike science fiction, rabies is real and terrifying. Not to mention that vampires in the oldest myths were unable to cross running water, whereas rabies apparently gives one a fear of water, to the point it's known as hydrophobia. Related, some of the earlier vampire myths talk about them having an insanely strong lust for women, and vampires would break in and sleep with them, with or without the blood sucking. It was generally a woman they fancied in life, like a husband looking for his wife, or a secret admirer looking for his crush, although some stories suggested they were strangers. It's believed that these were basically cover stories for some affairs. An adulterous couple would do their thing, then when signs of the entry and fun times were discovered, the woman could cover it up with voodoo like, and the townspeople would all be like, holy shit, we gotta protect this poor vampire victim, instead of thinking she was cheating. Didn't help that any sightings of the vampire would be a man in a dark cloak in the dead of night. So they'd lock the doors and all that, woman let the guy in, they'd go again, and in the morning she'd need to have an explanation. He hypnotized me to open the door, and they'd be like, holy shit, voodoo-lax can hypnotize people. It took off from there. Voodoo-lax is an incorrect spelling of an actual, early Romanian word for vampire which was popularized in family of the voodoo-lac, but I sadly can't remember the actual word. Apologies. Edit. Shout out to UI Fox King for looking at my rambling and figuring out what I was trying to say. I was looking for a Slavic, not Romanian word, voodoo-lac. Mystery solved. The comments have a lot of other great words though too, so scroll through if you want to be able to say vampire in a whole bunch of ways. Aren't people also afraid of water when infected? Would explain the holy water. The Kraken probably existed. It could just be a colossal squid, but those sailors had to have seen something. With colossal squids existing today, and the fact that animals were larger a long time ago, things like the megalodon, a kraken-sized squid, is certainly possible. You also have to remember how much smaller watercraft used to be. Large ocean-going vessels are an invention of only the last few centuries. A sail yacht you have at the marina is bigger than most historical boats. Even the carvels and junks that traverse the world were seldom much bigger than 20-something meters. The Cyclopes of Greek mythology. Go Google up an elephant skull. There's this huge hole right in the middle of it looking to all the world like a single eye. Now add this to the knowledge that the Cretan dwarf mammoth left subfossil bones on Crete easily discoverable, was 1 meter at the shoulder, and could be more or less assembled into a giant humanoid. The Greek heroes were bare skeletons that had been dug up and given proper burials in armor and later dug up again. You don't even need to rearrange the bones, just make the skeleton stand on its hind legs, remove the tusks and boom. A cyclops skeleton. Chupacabra. It has to be some poor sick animal with mange. Mange is highly contagious, so if a pack of coyotes or wild dogs got it, they would all have a weird ass appearance and attack other animals out of hunger. It's similar with jackalopes and wapaltingers. There's actually a cancer that causes rabbits to have large horn-like protrusions from its head. Specifically sarcoptic mange, demodectoc mange can cause a similar appearance but isn't contagious. But on that note, a lot of the video evidence I've seen circulated looks like coyotes with mange. A couple times raccoons. People don't realize just how weird certain animals look without their fur, but add crusty scabs all over and it can look like a monster. There's a small population of albino deer in my area and they are beautiful. Definitely ethereal looking and totally match the European description of a unicorn. The mythical unicorn likely derives from travelers from Africa or Asia to Europe trying to describe a rhinoceros. There are Asian rhinos in India, Nepal, and Indonesia. When you consider that ancient Greek depictions of lions sometimes look more like dogs and that the word hippopotamus comes from Greek words meaning river horse, it's easy to see how a Greek traveler would describe a rhino as a one-horned horse. There's linguistic evidence for this idea. 400 years ago it was believed that there were two types of rhinos. Ones with two horns were called rhinoceros and ones with a single horn were called unicorn. So the word unicorn was used to describe both real rhinos and the mythical one-horned horse. It wasn't until zoology advanced as a science that unicorn came to refer purely to the mythical creature. There are still remnants of the original usage though. The genus of the scientific names for Asian rhinos, which have one horn, is Unicornus. There's a good chance something like the Loch Ness monster existed at some point in time. As someone who lives there, I support this. However, I do not believe there is something there now. There are many theories regarding it, but the ones I like in particular are 1. Kelpie, total myth but still so good. 2. Elephant. Victorian animal circus letting their animals swim in the loch and elephants' trunks top of their heads look just like that famous picture when submerged. Based on multiple descriptions of the Australian cryptid, the Bunyip, I firmly believe them to be seals who swam inland. The kraken were likely colossal squid which swam up to the surface. The black demon shark of Mexico is just a large great white with pigment issues. I've got a few cryptozoology books that describe the Bunyip, and that's one of the more interesting cryptids for sure. The one thing that would separate them from common seals is that they are supposed to be quite massive, so I'm not sure if a misidentification of a seal would cut it for every sighting. I never heard of the black demon shark before. So now you've given me another cryptid to look up, so thank you. 1. I believe that stories of wild men, giants, hairy bipeds et al. Are rooted in hunter-gatherer cultures which existed on the periphery of civilization as defined by early subsistence farmers. 2. King Arthur existed as at least one post-Roman warlord. I totally agree with this, and those sightings would get passed down as legends that would keep growing over time for sure. Without a doubt. King Arthur's legend is simply too big to just be a tall tale, and he's probably even a collective legend of a few real-world leaders of lesser-known clans or knights. OROC could have been real. It was most likely inspired by the elephant bird of Madagascar. An elephant bird was like a big-ass ostrich about 9 feet high. They didn't go extinct until the 16th or 17th century. For sure. Also, even a condor could appear and probably be misidentified as being twice the size it is if someone that wasn't familiar with it saw one in the wild. I forgot where I read this, but when people are afraid of something out in the wild, their accounts of it can make it out to be much larger than the real thing due to stress or fear. The Lusca, giant octopus. It supposedly lives in the blue holes of the coast of Florida, and the amount of food and temperature of water both support the theory of an octopus living long enough to grow way larger than we expect based on our current records. The Wendigo probably existed, just not as a creature. People in the far north who survived a brutal winter by eating a family member had a psychological escape hatch for the guilt and horror by convincing themselves they were transforming into a ravenous, murderous beast. They'd continue killing and eating in a hysteric delusion that they had no control over it. Wendigo hunters would then have to come and kill them and perform a shamanic ritual to assure the rest of the tribe that the taint wouldn't spread. It's actually an incredibly fascinating study into culturally specific mental illness. The lengths the mind will go to in order to avoid dealing with a traumatic event are so extraordinary that in that culture they would actually continue to murder and cannibalize fellow tribe members under the delusion they had transformed into a monster. There's a very fascinating, but very depressing, segment of cross-cultural legal studies that looks as Wendigo lore also as representations for other horrors, namely family violence and child sexual abuse. I don't have the book on hand, but I remember the introduction was a tale about a girl who was continuously bitten by a male family member. A female ancestor guides her to a riverbank that can treat her wounds with good medicine. But she either forgets or is hurt too many times that she gives up, and ends up continuously biting her own daughter. Basically it tells the story of how abuse and pain can be passed down through families, and how people you love can be both victims and monsters. I think the book was Wittico Legal Principles. I always viewed it as a cautionary tale against cannibalism. Eating a human is such a despicable act, you can never come back, you're forever tainted. The delusion psychosis could also have been from Kuru, which is like a human version of mad cow disease, similar to Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in that all are caused by prions. The Maori people of New Zealand have long told stories of the pauke, a monstrous bird that was big enough to hunt and eat humans. Many believe that these stories are referring to the Haast seagull. It was the largest species of eagle ever to have lived on Earth, with weights of around 30 pounds and wingspans almost reaching 10 feet. It lived on New Zealand's South Island and primarily hunted the flightless moa bird, which weighed around 500 pounds. Given the large size of its main prey, it's likely that the eagle may have also targeted lone humans as well. Interestingly enough, the Haast eagle went extinct around the year 1400, not long after the Maori arrived in New Zealand. It's thought that its extinction can be attributed to habitat destruction combined with the extinction of the moa due to hunting by the Maori. There is a child's skull in a museum somewhere with markings on the back and front near the eye sockets. Originally archaeologists believed it to be linked to violence or sacrifice, until they discovered it matched the talons of the Haast eagle exactly, and that it had been discovered in a pile of bones similar to the piles left by modern birds of prey. Kid was about 6 and got bird snagged. I swear to God that New Zealand is where God did a line of cocaine and said, you know what these two islands need? Birds. Not just any birds, the biggest and baddest of all bird species. Seriously, not only did the Haast seagull and the moa live there, but millions of years before that, a giant penguin species lived there too that was just shorter than the average person. Like New Zealand had some badass birds. New Zealand is where birds of all kinds reign supreme. All hail the kiwi. Large unidentified predatory raptors in history happen to be one of the most plausible cryptids for sure, and I haven't heard of that one before. Thanks for sharing. One of my anthropology professors, Primate Evolution, is convinced Bigfoot exists and is the result of a line of Gigantopithecus that survived and has avoided human detection and capture for 100,000 years. There are actually several anthropologists who believe this theory. I find it highly unlikely that a big ape has avoided detection for thousands of years. That's awesome, actually. The problem with cryptids I've heard is that believing in the possibility of their existence or researching them publicly can damage the credibility of the person in the scientific world, so many people in various fields either don't bother researching them in the first place or even sharing what they think. The way I see it is that we probably aren't going to ever find something if we're not even looking for it in the first place when it comes to cryptids. A lot of ocean aquatic based creatures most likely do exist on the basis that most of the Earth's deep oceans haven't been fully explored. We have explored more of space than we have oceans. For sure. Accounts vary of course, but something like 95% of the world's oceans remain unexplored. There's no way that there isn't something massive down there, and I actually wouldn't be too surprised if something like a megalodon or a smaller creature somewhat in resemblance of it actually exists. There may have been a small population of Sasquatch-like creatures at some point, but I think the more likely creatures are the aquatic ones. Kraken and Loch Ness monster type things would leave less obvious evidence, with droppings and corpses disappearing into the depths. I'm not even one of the Bigfoot folks, but I'm hairy enough that I find it implausible there was never someone or something humanoid that fits the Sasquatch bill. Source: am a human male living in modern times. I believe that Bigfoot probably does exist. Or at least did until very recently. But I doubt that it was a unique species. My theory is that what people see is a mundane animal, probably a large brown bear, with serious genetic deformities. Encountering a 7-foot bear with mange, maybe a deformed cranium, possible scars from fights with other bears, and other such traits would certainly trigger a fight or flight response. You see something like that, you haul ass in the other direction. When you stop, you're not 100% certain of what you saw, so your brain fills in the details. So you take a deformed animal and mix it with an imaginative mind that knows what the popular version of Bigfoot looks like, and you get a bona fide Bigfoot sighting. You know, when a bear has been shot and skinned, it looks disturbingly humanoid. I won't say that you just debunked Bigfoot, but I sure would bet that someone, Somewhere has seen a particularly pitiful bear and thought it was an ape sort of thing. After all, an animal with no hair looks a lot like an animal with no skin. I've had a lifelong interest in cryptozoology, but I'm generally not a huge fan of Bigfoot because it would be so easy for people to create hoaxes with it. Your theory is actually one of the most plausible and interesting that I've ever heard about it. Thanks so much for sharing. Arthur. From the legendary people side of things, King Arthur was certainly someone who actually existed, albeit in a much different form than modern audiences would be familiar with. The earliest mentions of him are as a historical British king who lived during the 5th century. He's in a king list. He's mentioned as winning a series of decisive battles against the Saxons, and his excellent swordsmanship is referenced once. And that's about it. During the Middle Ages, Arthur's tale was romanticized and then conflated with other myths and folklore. Several of his knights, such as Lancelot, were originally heroes of their own legends before being added to his, until we finally ended up with our present version that has all the medieval knights and magic and the round table and the holy grail business. It's entirely possible that the name of Arthur itself was part of this later conflation, as his victories against the Saxons were also credited in some sources to a general named Ambrosius Aurelianus. Those sources may be wrong, or they may have been two different leaders who were mistakenly combined by later writers, a king and his general, perhaps. Among historians who support Arthur's historicity, the thinking goes that he was a Romano-British, i.e. Welsh, leader who fought against Saxon incursions and held them off during his lifetime, becoming ruler of part of Britain in the wake of Rome's withdrawal. His name would have originally been Roman, Artorius, which became Arthurus in the Vulgar Latin, and was later shifted to Arthur by Celtic influence in the 6th century. Troy. The Trojan War is another legendary event that was certainly based on something real. We know Troy was a real city that was actually raised around 1190 BC, and we have a lot of evidence that says the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittite Empire fought several conflicts over the city, which was a powerful city-state and vassal of the Hittites at the time. The Trojan War from the Iliad is either a legendary account of the most glorious Mycenaean victory in these wars, or perhaps a dramatization of the entire series of wars distilled into one mythical conflict. As for the people mentioned in the stories, no telling. Many were likely based on actual nobles from the conflicts, but Greek mythos has a habit of adding in later heroes to famous stories. Combined with the massive time gap before we inherit our earliest surviving copy of the story, at least some of the characters were probably added later. Serious scholarship tries to identify which parts of the Iliad are most guilty of this, and which parts most resemble its Bronze Age origins. My favorite thinking from the historicity debate on Troy is that the whole Helen situation was originally understood to be a metaphor for the actual transgression that the Trojans committed. Hittite letters suggest that they were the aggressors, but don't specify how. So we're left guessing about what sort of treaty violations or trade disputes that Helen might have been meant to represent. Trolls and unicorns, but in the form of Neanderthals and woolly rhinos. I believe our mass genetic social memory has kept the memory of the last surviving Neanderthals alive in the imagery of trolls, solitary, short, dark, hairy creatures living in caves, the woods, by rivers, etc. The woolly rhino, likewise, was passed along as a big four-legged creature with a horn from its snout and eventually four-leg turned into horse-like through broken telephone. I don't think Neanderthals fit trolls. Neanderthals weren't solitary creatures at all, they lived in community groups like we do. So even when the population was crashing, the survivors would still most likely stick together, not live a solitary existence, unless you're talking about like the literal last Neanderthal. The banshee was never real. But lots of Irish parents came up with a story about a screaming woman that kept their kids terrified and in their beds. The banshee's woeful wail meant kids had to stay in bed or get stolen away. This story was told so that the parents in question could have sex. Loud sex. Because the kids would have heard their mom's amorous moans and interpreted them as a ghostly call from beyond the grave. Aka yaw. That's pretty funny, but you bring up a fantastic point that many people aren't aware of outside of cryptozoology. Many legends were shared and told to children and young adults to actually keep them safe from harm, which would have been of particular importance back in olden times when death from nearly anything was rampant and a serious concern. There are lake monster stories told to keep children safe from swimming out too far in lakes or even going near bodies of water in the first place, or even forest monster stories to keep them from going out too far and getting lost. There's even the old legend of the Lambton worm in England, where I'm pretty sure it was told to children to keep them safe and cautious when being near or dealing with water wells. Those were deadly times back then, and folklore actually saved lives for sure. The problem was that the children would actually tend to keep believing these stories even into adulthood, so I'm sure that many legends in fact became real accounts in that way. I believe almost every culture has some version of a dragon. Chances are, something like it existed alongside mankind. I'm not talking about dinosaurs, either. I heard about a paleontologist looking for fossils in China. They went to the local Chinese medicine shop and asked the owner where he got the dragon bones he was making into powder and selling. The shop owner led them to a massive cache of dinosaur fossils. Sometimes the rock around fossils has eroded enough to make them clearly visible. It's entirely possible that dragon myths come from ancient people finding dinosaur fossils. I think unfortunate people in the past with hair disorders where hair covers their body are the root cause of people thinking up the idea of werewolves. This, mixed with the likely solitary lifestyle they had because people found them scary, led to people thinking that they were less than human, and it wasn't long before someone said they were an animal, or at least half animal. There is an Australian cryptid called the drop bear. It's essentially a carnivorous koala that drops down on people and eats them. I am without a shadow of a doubt sure that what they are describing is an extinct species of megafauna called Thylacolea carnifex. If you've seen how they look, you can understand why they are described as a carnivorous koala. They were arboreal like koalas and were also marsupials. Their name means pouched lion. Hell, they even had thumbs tipped with claws like koalas. Well, I suppose existed is being stretched here, but many people until fairly recently were adamant that cyclopes existed. The evidence they used turned out to be the skulls and bones of dinosaurs or elephants. There's also evidence for King Arthur existing, but similarly to Moses, it seems to have been a dude that did some stuff, but later other big fish stories got attributed to him, and it just grew over time. Back then it was common to change the names of the folk heroes so that the story itself would be remembered. Also dragons. Nearly every culture has a mythological giant lizard. In a way they are correct. Almost all of the evidence they gave turned out to be dinosaur bones fossils. Fun fact, trisomy 13 can cause babies to look like cyclops. The trisomy 13 rarely ever make it to birth, but I could see how people believed in cyclops. Western concepts of sea monsters highly resemble plesiosaurs and similar extinct animals. The myths could have been created after those fossils were discovered, or, hear me out, them shit's ancestors are still swimming around. I know you probably meant descendants, but man, can you imagine how damn unsettling it would be if there were still ancestors of things that died so long ago they were fossilized still swimming around in the depths like some sort of immortal Lovecraftian nightmare.